And I think that I just have to respectfully go, have a good life.
It wasn't an instantaneous thing. There wasn't an announcement or a mandate or an actual sitting down of the family and saying, okay, from now on, the matriarch of this family is going to be Robyn Brown. That's just not what happened. At first, it seemed like an accommodation. Small changes, minor allowances, temporary flexibility. Changes of the kind that occur in families when they think that they are maintaining harmony. But accommodation, when reiterated in the same direction, leads to structure. Structure, once formed, reconfigures all space below it. Robyn brought into this family at the point at which the system was already overextended. Years of managing multiple households at once, with divergent needs and scarce emotional resources, had led to burnout at this point in the system. The family system was still operating, but it had entered the stage of operating with momentum rather than with ease, with everyone adapting in their own way, emotionally, logically, psychologically. Into that situation came a person whose emotional cues came across differently. This caused a reaction on Robyn's. It caused her discomfort, which brought about. Her distress was considered an emergency. As in, not because she loudly demanded it, but because the system reacted to her as if the matter was of greater import to them. Initially, this all seemed like compassion, like care. If they're in pain, you help them. If they don't feel safe, you stabilize them. If they're struggling, you lean in. The issue wasn't the response itself. The difficulty was the pattern. Here's why. Where Robyn's needs, at least, were satisfied rapidly and boldly, the rest of them could be exhorted to wait, to understand, to bear in mind that patience was required. Their discomfort could, it was implied, be borne, could be sustained without action. This was what divided society along a fault line: response versus endurance. Robyn does not have to normalize her discomfort. She was not going to wait with such uncertainty. The situation with her emotions was not considered background noise. Conversely, the meter became the standard. Decisions in the family started to revolve around what would ensure Robyn was regulated, stable, and assured. This was not done in an overtly favorably manner. This was done in problem-solving logic. Whenever tension was present, the simplest thing to do was resolve the most vocal source of distress that disrupted the system, Robyn being the distressing element in the system. Others were portrayed as resourceful. While resilience was something to be applauded for, it also became, it is because once the individual has demonstrated the ability to carry the weight, then systems will readily provide them with more. Robyn's emotions were classified as signals which the system had to alter. The other wives' emotions were classified as conditions which the wives had to treat. This established all that would come after. Time allocation changed. There was an energy that pulled. Attention recalibrated. Robyn's role became the emotional barometer, the house in which the overall family move would next depend, the measure of stability, her comfort level. Again, none of this was bad-intentioned. It was efficient. In emotions, efficiency can be lethal because it maximizes calmness with a short-term perspective, forgetting that sometimes the quickest approach to defuse a bomb is not the fairest or safest one, but it could be the most attractive option. Robyn's family provided an element of predictability, a sense of emotional clarity, a clear message about when things were wrong and how wrongs would be righted. That made it easier to emotionally invest in that environment. It felt responsive, it felt engaged. Meanwhile, the women who had developed resilience were less vocal. It wasn't because they had less to say. It was because they discovered that saying so often didn't change that fact. Explanation was required. There was context. There was patience. There was a need for a response. There was a need for Robyn. With time, everyone learned a lesson, not that anyone expressed it. Robyn's emotions triggered the system. Other people's feelings adapted to this. Once this message is internalized, behavior shifts. People stop escalating. They finish insisting. They stop interrupting stability in order to ask for equity. They endure. It's the unseen things, the strength, the courage, the endurance. When the imbalance became apparent, it had already been normalized. The family could look back at certain incidents and explain them. It was not the same this time around. This was an isolated incident. The situation called for adaptability, all true in isolation, but together they constituted an organic truth that Robyn had become the emotional priority, not because she had claimed the right to do so, but because the system had conferred it on her. Priority doesn't necessarily look like favoritism, said. Sometimes it appears to be relief. Release of tension, removal from conflict, comfort from emotional unpredictability. Robyn was the escape the system needed, and a system in relief will rearrange itself in order to maintain it. However, this reorganization occurred at a cost. The price was paid in silence by those who were expected to keep on working irrespective of what they were going through. It was assumed that it was a strength. It was assumed that it was a norm. It was assumed that it was infrastructure. They are the ones who sustained the system until the system was stabilized around someone else. This marked the start of the emotional hierarchy. Not applicable. Not defended, but very deeply enforced through repetition. And once the priority in emotion is established, all else, time, loyalty, protection, and decision-making follows in its wake. The kind that would impact their future. Once the emotional priority is implanted, it will have a sway that leads to some decisions that may seem sound at the time, but cumulatively go down a certain path. No one wakes up with the intention to tip the scales. What happens is that a chain of decisions is made that seem sound but tilt towards one particular side. The family learned over time the address of emotional stability. When Robyn sensed imbalance, it was perceptible at the systems level. Communication occurred quicker, decisions changed quicker, explanations became more considered. There was a sense of urgency to rebalance, since her imbalance was seen to pose a threat to the family's overall functioning. It wasn't because her feelings were louder. It was because they were treated as if they mattered. However, when other wives felt unsettled, the dynamics were entirely different. Their feelings of unease were recognized, but also reinterpreted. A larger picture was pointed out to them. Patience was encouraged in them. Their feelings were asked to be viewed in the context of the needs of the family. These feelings were not suppressed, they were regulated. And management also involves endurance. With the passing of time, there emerged two emotional roles within the family. One role was reactive. Feelings led to taking an action. The other role was absorptive. Feelings needed to be internally processed to allow the system to run smoothly. Robyn was in the reactive position. The others used the absorptive one. This breakdown wasn't bargained out as part of an agreement. It was key to repetition and reinforcement. Every time Robyn's discomfort prompted changes, it proved that she could influence by making herself important in the moment. Every time others could survive discomfort, it proved that they could wait. Survivable, but not sustainable. With this trend emerging, emotional energy became unevenly distributed. Focus drifted towards where it felt like making the most impact. Emotional investment took the route requiring the least effort, where progress was evident. Robyn's family was that place. Participation in that community felt quite effective. Needs were well-defined, reactions were timely. Feel and effort led to resolution. This closed loop drove further investment. Participation felt productive and not draining. On the other hand, emotional involvement in other relationships called for wait-and-see situations without an answer in return. Talk took longer without an end result in sight. Concessions were postponed. Progress was gradual or none at all. Emotional investment was heightened without. This contrast taught all of us a subtle but potent lesson. Where effort counted, where it didn't, where energy should be conserved. No one had to say it out loud. Behavior was easily adaptable. Time followed comfort. Presence was followed by relief. Stability came after predictability. The emotional topography of Robyn was what needed to be maintained as a smooth surface. Other people were expected to make their way through difficult terrain without complaint. Resilience was part of this infrastructure, hidden, present as a presumption, its work unwitnessed. As long as these lasted, the system could carry on without facing disharmony. This resilience became the safety net of the system, and as with all safety nets, it was used without being strengthened. Robyn was not required to toughen up because the system was flexible for her delicacy. Other students were required to toughen up because the system was not flexible for them. It was not presented as favoritism, it was presented as common sense. However, practicality repeated without reflection becomes policy. In fact, policy shapes identity. The women who remained in their marriages, however, gradually absorbed one message in particular. Their feelings were true, but they weren't urgent. Very important, but not consequential. Worth listening to, but not important enough to build the system around. Robyn's emotions, on the other hand, actually influenced outcomes. Such differences influenced the way conflict was handled. Conflicts that involved Robyn were dealt with in a way that focused on resolving them. Conflicts that involved other people were viewed as tensions that could be endured until they went away. Care and tolerance are not the same things, but once that distinction is made clear, trust starts to deteriorate. The family went on and continued to operate. However, emotionally, balance was being eroded. The family structure was no longer asking everyone to bear equal weight. Some people were supposed to stabilize. Some were supposed to be stabilized around. This disparity didn't declare its presence as a crisis. It had a calm demeanor.
And calm, when imperfectly maintained, conceals the true expense of who is doing the work of maintaining calm. The cost, by the time it could be seen, already had the ranks of the emotions firmly positioned, and it would take more than good intentions to undo it. There would be a need to tackle the system.
With this emotional hierarchy in place, it started influencing not just reactions to conflict, but also behavior expectations. The family was reacting to Robyn's emotions in different ways, but now it started anticipating them. Before decisions were made in any other place in the family, they first considered where they'd be received on an emotional level. The anticipation of this demand is the point at which priority becomes power. Not overt power, not declared authority, but influence over. When individuals start pre-adjusting in order not to distress another person, this person suddenly becomes the focus of the system's balance. Their comfort ceases being just another factor within the system and becomes a kind of threshold which the system tries not to overpass. Robyn's emotional experiences were the threshold. Plans emerged in consideration of her to avoid upsetting her. Tone in conversations was adjusted to placate her. Expectatives adjusted to accommodate her. Even when no voice mentioned her name, she was felt in conversations. The system understood that stability meant maintaining one environment steady, and to that effect, it acted accordingly. The other wives noticed this not with a single glimmer of realization, but cumulatively. They observed whose feelings interrupted conversations, whose discomfort prompted an urgent follow-up, whose discomfort led to rethoughts, and whose did not. Their emotions were rarely viewed as a problem. They were viewed as a problem to be managed, a problem to be calmed, to be comforted, to be dealt with quietly, as opposed to publicly as a problem to be solved. Adaptation was now expected. Gradually, adaptation begins to be conflated with consent, even when it's not. A lack of voices is interpreted as an agreement. Long suffering is equated with acceptance. We see the system humming along and working well when the emotional mathematics is compromised. But Robyn had no such adjustments to make. These emotional responses would interrupt her. These would be considered as signals for attention. This is not strictly because she interrupted it, but because the system required an interruption for the balance effect. This caused a paradox. The more centered her emotions were, the more delicate the system seemed to be without the centering. The more the system needed her stability, the more her stabilization was worthy of priority, and so on. The rest of the people were supposed to control themselves in order for the whole system to continue operating. This division altered the allocation of responsibility. Responsibility for emotions was relocated from the system to individuals, but in Robyn's situation, it rippled out. Responsibility for emotional welfare rested with the family. It was not something she had to bear alone. For the other wives, emotional safety became a personal responsibility. They developed a skill set in coping with disappointment, coping in silence, handling disappointment by reframing unmet need as a temporarily denied need, bringing down expectations in line with realities. The coping mechanism brought down public expression. Why complain about a need that would demand patience? Robyn's problems, by contrast, led to progress. This served to strengthen her belief that the emotional need was the priority. The family did not say this. They said it was careful, it was considerate, it was a man who avoided conflict. However, one-sided consideration is not consideration, it is inequality. And if there is a lack of balance in the... But what? Trust starts to erode. Not because people feel unwanted, but because people feel invisible. Not because they are unheard, but because they are unacknowledged. The distinction is important. The women who adjusted felt that equal opportunities and emotion no longer could be had in the way that the structure was now. They didn't feel angry at this point. They simply observed. They observed patterns and concluded. Robyn's experience reinforced a different message, one of safety and emotional investment, of getting from expression care, of trusting stability. Her connection to the system was maintained because the system continued to meet her at her level. These two realities cannot coexist indefinitely. The first one involved adjustment, the other on accommodation. But accommodation, when it focuses, necessarily creates distance elsewhere. At this level, the emotional imperative was not only impacting decisions, it was constructing identity itself. Roles had been established, and so had expectations. The system required neither explanations nor apologies. It just worked. What it cultivated was a family that was apparently calm and composed on the exterior, but imbalanced inside. With roles being more defined, the emotional hierarchy started affecting not only what they decided, but also who they became. They started judging themselves based on what the emotional hierarchy demanded of them. The women who learned internalized responsibility to keep everything running smoothly. They learned to expect the worst and deal with the consequences. Emotional self-regulation came naturally, not as a way of taking care of themselves, but as a survival tool for the system. They became careful with their words. When they extremely selective regarding needs. Expected outcomes are measured to gauge their expectations. It wasn't surrender, it was calibration. When individuals understand that stating certain needs will not bring about genuine change, they don't cease needing, they cease to ask. And once the asking ceases, the visibility fades away. But Robyn's experience went in the opposite way. Her emotional expressions remained visible, actionable, and consequential. When she was upset, there was a reaction. This reinforced the notion of the point of expression. It reinforced the validation of emotional expression. This had a long-term impact. The women who stayed started to conserve their emotional resources. They stopped investing to the fullest because their investment was no longer safe. They avoided being disappointed. Robyn's family was receiving continued investment because it felt responsive. Emotional expenditure in this family yielded feelings of being replenished as opposed to drained. Consequently, there was an imbalance in attention and emotional life. One environment remained fertile. The others ran on reserve. The problem was not detected by the system because it was hidden by endurance. As long as the adopted wives continued to work, there would be no problem. Everything looked normal. The family looked normal. The arguments sounded quiet. The tensions could be held. However, the containment of problems is not the same. Emotions are contained, but they don't disappear. They begin to accumulate in ways that impact behaviors long before they affect speech. Engagement becomes selective. Presence becomes conditional. Participation becomes strategic. This change occurred without the need for a confrontation. It required recognition. The wives who were able to adjust began to realize that emotional equity was no longer possible under the current structure that existed, not due to the actions of an individual, but due to the way that the system treated individuals differently. Robyn did not establish this relationship on her own. This system was rewarded. This system had elements reinforced in it. This system had people safeguarded in it, people who found relief in the avoidance of conflict and the unknowingness of emotion. A peace based on disproportion is frail. It hangs upon people absorbing discomfort as well. It relies upon a resilience which is never replenished, and once this resilience dries up, the peace falls apart silently. At this stage, emotional priority had developed into emotional dependency. The system was relying on Robyn's emotional regulation to feel stable. Emotional dependency also provided justification for further emotional priority. Consequently, the two developed into a cycle that was hard to break. The remaining wives were expected to control their behavior in order not to destabilize the whole system. This was never presented as being unfair. This was presented as maturity, strength, commitment. But strength that is expected without assistance eventually becomes a load. But pressures change relationships. When one feels constantly responsible for the restoration of balance, the bond weakens. Trust dams up when the expression of it feels risky. When the expression of care is not met with an equal expression of care, love becomes conditional. Robyn's case was different in that a sense of reciprocity was still possible in that setting. The emotional cues were triggering a care response. This maintained a connection. It maintained a level of trust. It maintained a level of significance in one's participation. The gap between these experiences grew. Not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. But before the family could talk about more significant changes, the emotional foundations had already shifted. Decisions seemed less emotional since many of them had been met mentally well before they were verbalized. The wives who adapted were no longer trying to change the system. They were evaluating if they could stay in it. That is not something that needed anger. That needed honesty. And honesty has the ability to bring clarity where endurance had created obscurity. The emotional priority had done its job. It had stabilized one side of the family while secretly draining the other side. The system had optimized for peace in the short term at the cost of balance in the long term. What was left was not conflict. It was reckoning.
Reckoning does not come with bluster. It comes with silence. A recognition that striving has been stretched as far as it can without the erasure of the self. By this point, the wives who had conformed had moved beyond attempts to readjust balance. They were counting the cost. Not emotional cost in theory, but lived cost. The cost of explaining the same feelings over and over again. The cost of waiting for responses that never came. This is the cost of staying emotionally available in a system that had already decided whose availability mattered most. What differentiated this stage from earlier moments of frustration was clarity. The pattern was no longer confusing. It was consistent, predictable. And once a pattern becomes predictable, it loses its power to surprise, but gains the power to instruct. The instruction was simple. Do not expect anything in return. The wives who suffered started to behave in a manner that accorded with that directive. They didn't dramatically retreat. They didn't declare boundaries. They changed on the inside first. Emotional exposure went down. Investment was deployed discriminately. Availability wasn't reflex any longer. This was not punishment. Self-preservation was in play. Meanwhile, Robyn's experience was uninterrupted. Her emotive signals still yielded reaction. Her needs still stirred activity. That continuity sustained her sense of belonging and involvement. She stayed hooked up to the system because the system kept hooking back up. This difference meant much more than could ever any argument. Connection isn't sustained by proximity alone. It's sustained by responsiveness, and responsiveness had become uneven. As responsiveness was reduced elsewhere, the system relied even more heavily on the emotional environment that still functioned smoothly. Robyn's household did not just become a priority, it became a refuge, the place where emotional exchange still felt productive. That reliance deepened the imbalance. The more the system leaned into what worked, the less incentive it had to repair what didn't. In order to repair, one has to feel discomfort, adjustment, accountability. One has to lean into spaces where emotions are left unresolved. The endurance had previously absorbed that discomfort. Once the endurance was taken away, the avoidance was opted by the system. Avoidance looks like peace, until it doesn't. The wives who adjusted behaved with the realization that emotional presence no longer affected outcome. Their presence did nothing to change priorities. Patience did not restore equity. Silence wasn't heard as concern, it was interpreted as consent. That misreading proved to be decisive. Silence is only consent when one still feels invested in the outcome. When that investment fades, silence becomes distance, and distance, once established, changes everything. Here is where emotional disengagement starts, not as rejection, but realism. Realism with regard to what is possible, realism about what is improbable, realism about what continuing to hope will cost. Robyn never reached the stage because her experience simply never required it. Her emotional investment, in a nutshell, continued being responded to. There was no need to withdraw when forward still worked. The system, in preserving her stability, inadvertently gave away its priorities. And once priorities have been revealed, people act accordingly. By now, wives who endured were no longer asking themselves how to save the family. They had another question in mind, how much of themselves they'd lose by staying. Dramatic answers that question does not produce. It produces quiet decisions. Decisions to step back emotionally, the need to cease overfunctioning, to let the system feel what it had for so long been protected from. Centuries of endurance had shielded the family from imbalance. Now without it, it became visible, not as chaos, but as absence. Lack of trying, no negotiation, absence of emotional availability. And absence is harder to argue with than anger, a point of no return. Not because anyone slammed a door, but because no one was holding it open anymore. When no one is holding the door open anymore, movement becomes inevitable. Not dramatic movement, not impulsive exits, but gradual reorientation. The wives who had adapted began to shift their emotional center of gravity away from the family structure and back towards themselves. This move was not announced, it was practiced. They said less, practiced waiting less. I learned to expect less. Often, pain begins with expectation, and then once the expectation is reduced, so is the exposure. This was not bitterness, it was boundary setting with no spectacle attached, a recalibration, so to say, of what participation meant when reciprocity could no longer be assumed. Robyn's position didn't change because the system still met her emotionally where she stood. It continued to feel worth it to her to engage in the system. Her emotional cues still got care, reassurance, and response. That continuity reinforced her place within the structure, even as others quietly disengaged. The gap grew wider. One part of the family went on relating and responding. Other parts moved into self-containment. The two cannot coexist with tension indefinitely. One is based on mutual exchange, the other on emotional independence. The system had understood distance for independence. But it wasn't about distance, it was about sustainability. The wives who withdrew were not trying to punish or withdraw love. They were husbanding their emotional resources. They had learned that availability without effectiveness is burnout, that love without return is erosion. Once that lesson settles in, behavior changes for good. Participation becomes conditional. Investment becomes intentional. Presence becomes selective. This is where the misinterpretation usually occurs. A system that begins to view reduced engagement as disinterest, disloyalty, instead of a response against long-standing imbalance. Reduced engagement is not rejection, it's feedback. The feedback it struggled to hear was the system that had grown accustomed to endurance absorbing the consequences. Robyn's experience shielded her entirely from this stage. Her emotional needs were still recognized as system relevant. She did not need to disengage since engagement continued to function as intended. This difference was not about effort, it was about outcome. Effort getting response invites more effort. Effort which produces silence sooner or later stops. As emotional withdrawal continued elsewhere, the system leaned even more heavily on what felt stable. Robyn's household became the emotional constant, not because it was perfect, but because it remained responsive. That responsiveness was now rare. This reliance reinforced the original imbalance. The more the system was centered around Robyn's emotional environment, the more distant others felt. The less distant others felt, the less incentive the system had to change. It was a loop sustained by uneven responsiveness. By then, what would have worked was reconciliation entailing structural change, not reassurance, not conversation, and not promises. Structural change is difficult. Structural change disrupts comfort. It requires redistributing emotional labor. It demands accountability. That rupture was avoided by the system. And avoidance has consequences. The wives who waited, who endured, were no longer waiting for change. They were preparing for continuity without the system. They weren't planning exits yet. They were strengthening internal independence, rebuilding confidence outside of the family's emotional framework. It is at this stage that attachment becomes irreversible. Not out of any anger, not due to conflict, but because life outside the imbalance starts to feel calmer. Calmness that doesn't require self-erasure. Calmness that is not based on someone else's approval. Peacefulness that does not use stamina as a prerequisite.
Once this calm is experienced, there is no need or desire to return to that state of imbalance. Robyn never needed to find that calm elsewhere, as her environment still provided it. It's a case of protection by the system from the conditions that compelled others to look elsewhere. This is how emotional priority becomes destiny. Not through intention, not by declaration, but through whom it is supported and who is asked to survive without support. By now, the family was no longer unraveling. It was reorganizing around reality, and reality no longer needed for everyone to stay.
However, once reality began to set in, the family's emotional tides began to shift in ways that could never be undone. The system ceased to be a place where everyone played a role with an equal stake in holding it all together. The system now existed on momentum, and momentum only continues as long as the thing pushing it continues to push. All those years, the pressure had been coming from endurance. Conclusion: endurance filled the gaps. Endurance minimized neglect. Endurance made imbalance livable. When endurance was removed, the system no longer had its invisible engine. The women who had adapted no longer emotionally overfunctionalized to compensate for what was being missed. They quit translating silence to patience. They quit translating delay to intention. They accepted what the system was actually offering, not what it had once promised. It was a liberating experience. It eradicated confusion. It put an end to negotiations. It brought clarity instead of emotional bargaining. However, change was still not required by Robyn's experience. The emotional context remained conducive to reassuring, attending, and responding. From her experience, the system was still functioning. Again, the perceptual gap widened. One side has erosion. The world is moving in two different. This created a situation wherein a positive repair was impossible. A positive repair needs shared recognition of a problem. When shared recognition of a problem is absent, repair endeavors seem incongruent. The women who had endured were no longer invested in sustaining a situation that required their erasure. Certainly, they didn't have to explain or defend their position. The cost-benefit analysis had already taken place. Sometimes it happens. It is where feelings of separation and non-engagement merge in resolution. Not closure in a dramatic sense. Not vindication. But peace. Justice translated as the absence of the need to extract equity from an inequitable system. The emotional needs of the family had gotten so ingrained that it would have required the deconstruction of the same structure that offered a sense of safety to some who enjoyed that privilege. Such deconstruction is a matter that calls for urgency, humility, and collective sacrifice. None of these circumstances were true. Consequently, the system defaulted to preservation, preserving what felt stable, preserving what worked, preserving what required least adaptation. A healthy family, like Robyn's, continues to fulfill such criteria. The family has a legible, responsive, and bounded system capacity. The system keeps the family protected, not because it favors it, but because it needs it so much, because stability has become a scarce commodity, and it is the nature of scarcity to be. At the same time, the women who had been involved learned there was life beyond the emotional framework the family provided, and it contained something they had not remembered existed, which was relief without guilt. Relief which did not require explanation. Relief that didn't need approval. Relief that didn't come at someone else's expense. It became a point of reference. When you know what it is like to have to exist without having to accommodate yourself in order for another person to be comfortable, it becomes an unnecessary act, even an unreasonable act, to be off balance again. At this point, the empathetic priority has reached the end of its journey. What initially started off as an accommodation now became what happened. Structure became expectation. What became the norm became the separation. Not because people were forced to leave, but rather because it was necessary to renounce themselves too much to stay. The family did not end in chaos. It ended in alignment. There must be alignment with reality, alignment with capacity, alignment with what could no longer be sustained. And then, by the time the alignment took effect, there was nothing left to discuss. The system had already answered the question, who it would protect, and who it thought would survive. So by the time alignment trumped negotiation, this emotional distance within the family had already translated into something structural. Where once there was aggravation, there was now a sense of what felt like permanent distress. Nothing about this system was now breaking down. It was now settling. And settlement alters behavior. The wives who had remained stopped checking in. They stopped looking for emotional signs to guide how much of themselves the space would allow. They pressed forward with what they could stand inside of themselves,
regardless of how it kept up the appearance of keeping it together. This was not bitterness. It was autonomy. Autonomy arises when individuals stop waiting for a permission slip to feel whole. Autonomy is a subtle thing, appearing through stronger boundaries and fewer explanations, through making decisions without practicing responses to those decisions. When autonomy asserts itself, the problem of emotional dependency evaporates. Robyn's position in the family also depended on emotional interdependence. The stability that Robyn experienced was maintained by the sensitivity of the system. This interdependence kept Robyn right in the middle while other people moved entirely away from the center. It was important. The first approach was to emotionally connect. The second depended on emotional self-sufficiency. These are divergent paths. As the lack of autonomy elsewhere in the relationship increased, the misinterpretation continued to be that it meant an absence of involvement, not growth from it. The lack of emotional involvement was seen as withdrawal rather than an adjustment that comes from need. The women who suffered were no longer trying to be understood. They understood enough. They knew that their emotional priority was not balanced. They knew that endurance had been mistaken for consent. They realized that stability remained a selective attribute. The need to understand eliminates urgency. When the sense of urgency passes, the need to debate ceases. Robyn's system continued to function because it still had investment emanating from the system. This gave the impression as if things could still work in the family, at least at one place. However, operating independently is not an aspect of cohesiveness. The family members now lived in different worlds of feeling. One reality was grounded in maintenance, in holding on to that which felt intact. The other was based on movement, stepping towards something healthier, even when it meant leaving the solid ground of the known. Neither of these realities were incorrect. They, however, had no future at this point. Reconciliation would have required an allocation of emotional burden. Reconciliation would have required that those who were shielded should share the pain, and those who were suffering should share less. But that redistribution never happened. Not because it was impossible, but because it threatened the stability the system had grown dependent upon. And dependency resists change. Therefore, the family appeared peaceful on the surface, but in a state of divergence on the internal level. The absence of conflict was interpreted as a state of peace, but in actuality, it was a consequence of disengagement. The former was of a type that occurs when people cease to expect change in the structure. This completes the task of emotional priority, not through establishing winners and losers. However, by making continued participation optional. As soon as the option to participate becomes optional, only those who are continuing to see their needs met will care enough to stay involved. Some people will leave without fanfare, not in anger, not in protest, but in self-respect. The ending was not loud. It was simply no longer shared.
When it comes into question, the real form comes into view. Certainly not the form it shows in public, but the form it maintains in the background. Who attends, who disappears into the horizon, and who considers themselves no longer obliged to answer for themselves. At this point, the emotional topography of the family was already completely polarized. The wives who endured stopped measuring their connection based on proximity and history. They measured their connection based on impact, based on whether their presence affected anything, whether their presence made a difference or was endured. The answer had already been clear. Their presence was no longer required to make the system feel stable. But that realization was not painful in the way that the pain of rejection is. It clarified what the actual relation of the system was and what it provided. One that was conditional, unequal, and based on the suppression of the self. Attachment will naturally unravel when hope is replaced with clarity. The role in the system didn't change for Robyn, since her emotional presence in the system was still required. The system reacted to her. It adapted for her. It reset itself for her, because her needs had been incorporated in her sense of equilibrium. So this wasn't favoritism in the classical sense. It was reliance. Reliance leads to prioritization because it feels threatening to lose that which you rely on. That which you are reliant upon is clearly important to protect because it makes sense to want to safeguard that which you rely on. The reason why the system upheld Robyn was that it knew that it has come to rely on the prediction. Other people were no longer depended upon to the same extent. They had turned into voluntary contributors instead of vital participants. This paradigm shifted everything. What appeared to be neglect was now seen as displacement. Emotional labor was simply being redistributed, not diminished. Some people are being asked to carry less of a load, while others are being asked to carry themselves. It can best be understood in terms of a redistribution of affection, which the wives who stuck by him could recognize without having it spelled out for them. Indeed, recognition sometimes requires confrontation, but sometimes it requires honesty. Honesty regarding sustainability. Honesty regarding what is reciprocal. Honesty about what continuing to invest will cost. After those costs are recognized,
things adjust by themselves. Despite this, communication becomes factual rather than emotional. Engagement becomes finite and no longer open-ended. Distance becomes comfortable rather than painful. In fact, Robyn has never needed to go to this level because her experience has never required her to do so. Her emotional investment receives continued response. This serves to maintain her tie within the system. Her status in the system is maintained. The family at this point had become a system in existence through habit, rather than through shared purpose. Habit may preserve appearance, but it cannot restore equitability. And in the lack of equitability, affection declines gradually. The system did not collapse. It settled down on what worked. But what was operational was not a complete family, but a reduced setup that needed less customization. This downsized labor force, however, was recognized as a loss, not a simplification. Fewer conflicts, fewer dilemmas, fewer mood swings. However, simplification means a trade-off. What was lost was not chaos. It was diversity of emotional contribution, shared responsibility, mutual adaptation. These losses did not register in their minds as emergencies because they happened gradually. Each move was doable. Each disappearance was temporary. Until it wasn't. As of now, it no longer required a decision about the outcome. It had already arrived. The family did not break down despite the pressure. It contracted to the point of imbalance. Moreover, this range having been reduced to a point, it couldn't extend again, because this would mean that emotional priority would be assigned in a dramatically different manner. This happened. Change never came. By the end, no debating opportunity remained. No argument that was yet to be had. No misunderstanding that required clarification. The answer to the key question had already been given. Who the system would protect, and who it would no longer require. There had been an end to the remodeling of everything by the What was structure became expectation, and what came to be expected shaped who could remain involved, who could stay attuned, and who simply ceased to try. The women who stayed didn't leave in anger. They left in alignment. Alignment with what the system could realistically provide them, and what it couldn't. Alignment with what she could provide herself, and not in line with what the family needed. They did not reject the family. They no longer compensated for it. Robyn's status was maintained because the system was still needing her emotional steadiness in order for itself to feel coherent. Robyn's needs were still operational. Robyn's pain was still eliciting a reaction. This reaction maintained connection, trust, and investment. It was not a question of one winning and the rest losing. It was more about how emotional labor was allowed to fall. Long ago, imbalance had been made bearable by resilience. It tempered disparity. It masked an uneven ratio as loyalty. Without the resilience, imbalance would no longer be masked by functionality. And when the imbalance becomes noticeable, it doesn't take a confrontation to finish things. It simply makes continuation illogical. The family did not implode. It failed to explode. It resolved. Broke down into what it had long been. One constructed on maintaining oneself within a certain emotional space, while expecting others to regulate themselves ad infinitum. One that prized stability over equity, efficiency over reciprocity, relief over repair. Once the truth about this was realized in full, the ending was inevitable. Not dramatic. Not cruel. Not sudden. Already completed. The way Robyn Brown was made the priority emotionally is not a story of intention. It is not a story of who was at fault. It is in fact a story of patterns. Patterns of reaction. Patterns that protect within times of stress by the system. Systems always show their priorities in the end. Not through what they say, but through whom they respond. Who they adjust for, and whom they are expecting to withstand. But then, once endurance gives up, clarity emerges. And clarity doesn't argue. It simply moves on.